What's up, AP Psychers? Welcome to your third and final installment on social psychology. Today is the psychology of social situations. Basically, not just social thinking, but when we're actually amongst a group of people. How do we act the same and differently, and how do we think the same and differently, and all that stuff. This is a pretty interesting one, but it's also jam-packed, so I'm going to dive right in. A lot of learning targets on this guy. Let's get to it. The first major idea in this lecture is the social influence theory. So this theory tries to explain how the actions of others shape or pressure the way individuals think and behave. So this is trying to explain creation of social norms and why we follow them. So many of you have probably learned about norms before, but norms are a group's expectations regarding what is acceptable for members' attitudes and behaviors. So if you're in a group, what is normal? So think of things like I've got a list of examples. Perhaps what to wear, or how to talk, or how to approach someone, or how to casually engage in conversation. But how can you do it while fitting in? So typically we fall into social norms for either normative reasons or informative reasons. A normative reason is exactly what it sounds like. You want to feel normal. You want to avoid rejection or gain social approval. So, like if you go play golf, you might wear like a collared shirt and shoes with spikes in them. But you wouldn't wear that to play basketball. That's not normal. People would look at you weird and probably get mad if you were on the gym floor. But if you're doing something from informative social influence, it means you're following the crowd because you're assuming that they have information or a level of understanding that you don't. You accept the opinions of others because the group may provide valuable information. So let's say you're getting ready for one of your first job interviews or like career-based interviews, not just like a small short-term kind of high school job, but like a big important career job. You might go with the flow in terms of advice someone gives you on what to wear, on how to approach the person doing the interview and shake their hands. And maybe you're dressing a little bit differently or speaking a little bit differently than you would in your normal life, but you're doing it because you've been informed or you know that in this setting you should act a certain way. So it's not just about fitting in, but you're trying to um, make a decision or make an action based on somebody else's advice because you admit that, hey, to fit in, to be normal, I just need to trust somebody else because I don't know enough about the situation. Um, let's see, perhaps you need to talk, you go to a gathering of people and you talk about certain topics in certain ways. In one hand, to hang out with your friends and seem cool, but in the other ways, to learn and ask questions and talk about the topics that the group wants to talk about. Okay, that's quite a few examples. In the idea of social influence and following norms, we're going to look both at conformity and obedience, the difference between the two, and why we do one and the other. So, conformity is adjusting one's behavior or thinking to fit with a group standard. So, definitely trying to fit into social norms. But, like, why do we do that? And are we always doing that? Are we always trying to kind of be like chameleon and blend in? What makes us do that more often than not? So in your notes, you've got a spot for a famous study, and you're just going to put down the name. I'm still going to tell you about it, but put down the name and we'll kind of like dive into it a little deeper in class. But the first major study, or the major study that aligns with conformity is that of Solomon Asch's line study. This is a famous experiment testing levels of conformity. And participants would be in a room with 9 Confederates, remember 9 actors, who all gave the same wrong answer to the question of A, B, or C, which line is the same length as this starting line? And all 9 people would say something like A, and there would be one person that they were actually testing. And what Ash was trying to see is if we have all these other people saying it's A when it's clearly not, what will that person do? Well, he found about 1/3 of the people tested conformed to the wrong group answer because they wanted to fit in. 75% of all participants conformed at least once throughout the experiment. So sometimes they said what they truly believed was the right answer, but over a third in the original trial, and then 75% in all sorts of different settings conformed to the group, even though they clearly knew the line was the wrong length. What made more people seem to conform? The size of the group. When it seemed like three or more people were in agreement, the more people that agreed, others were likely to conform. The status of the group. If you were kind of lower status, if you were new, if and it seemed like everybody else knew each other, or they all seemed more official and you felt maybe younger or just less cool, you're more likely to conform if you feel like low man on the totem pole, so to speak. Observation of the group. This is really interesting. If people could give their answers in private and remain anonymous, they were more likely to be honest. In other words, less likely to conform. When they have to give their answers out loud, more likely to conform, more likely to have to try to fit in. And then the unanimity of the group, another word I hate to say, if everybody in the group was unanimous, if everybody in the group agreed, people are very likely to conform. Now, going up one level of intensity is obedience. So, not just wanting to fit in, but actually changing your behavior in response to the command of someone with authority. Why do we obey? What happens in a person that makes them obey? Well, a very famous study on this is Stanley Milgram's shock experiment. Stanley Milgram investigated the effects of authority on obedience. He would have one person, the subject of the actual study, act like the participant, and he or a research assistant would act like a doctor and told the subject to shock another participant who was out of sight in another room if they answered a question wrong. This one's a little tricky, and we'll watch some videos to make sure we understand these experiments. But basically, they would say, like, hey, Joey, who's the one being studied, I'm going to put Jane in the room next door. I'm going to give her a memory quiz. You're going to hear her over the loudspeaker. If she gets it right, do nothing. If she gets it wrong, shock her. But then every single time she got something wrong, shock her with a higher level of intensity. Well, what he found is that 65% of participants obeyed up to 450 volts. And this would be a volt level. I don't know if I have it in my notes, but this would be a volt level that could be lethal. And what Jane would do in the other room every time she got shocked is she would be like, ow, ow, stop, no, stop, stop, ow. And Milgram would say something along the lines of, please continue. For the sake of the experiment, you must continue. So what made these people continue? When asked why they were willing to hurt someone or shock someone upwards to a lethal level, why did they obey? Most said they felt that the experimenter was ultimately responsible for what happened to the other participant. In other words, we were just following orders. It's not our fault. Well, something I forgot to lead with when I was explaining the upfront part of Milgram's experiment is that Milgram was really interested in why did so many people in Germany in the 1930s obey the Nazi Party? Why were so many people willing to turn in Jewish people, potentially hurt Jewish people? Why were so many Nazi soldiers willing to hurt so many people? And a lot of their defenses in Nazi after the Nazis were brought down was I was just following orders. So that's what a lot of people also said at the end of Milgram's experiment. What else was influencing people to obey? The prestige. The higher the status of the institution or authority figure. So Milgram did his experiment at Yale. So people trusted Yale as this prestigious institution that, well, they're not going to have me do something too dangerous. And if they are, it must be okay because they seem very official. Foot in door phenomenon that we learned about 2 lectures ago, that people were more willing to obey in small amounts, like I'll just shock a little bit. But once they did it, once they shocked just a little bit, a little voltage level, they were willing to go higher and higher and higher. So you can get someone to obey by asking them to do something small and then increase the intensity or severity of it. The presence of others affected whether or not they obeyed. If the authority figure was in the room, the person saying, you must continue. I'm wearing a white lab coat and I'm holding a clipboard. Like, here's my clipboard. And I'm super official, so you must continue. Okay, so if they were in the room, or if the person being shocked was in the room with them, that would make them either shock more or less. depending if they could see their victim or if the person bossing them around was right there. Or if they saw, I think that should be if, not of, if they saw somebody else disobey, if they saw someone else say, no, I'm not going to shock them anymore, this is getting out of hand, then the other person would be like, me too, I'm not going to shock anymore. What would happen, one of another phenomenon is that if the victim was depersonalized or the shocker person was depersonalized, like you didn't know each other, or someone was in another room, you couldn't see them, then the person was more likely to obey and continue shocking. Like, I don't know them, I can't see them. This, they're not really a person to me. Then you'd be more willing to obey these really bad orders. And then ultimately, it depends on the person. Personality or cultural beliefs would influence how much someone was willing to just obey. Are you from an individualist culture, a collectivist culture, or a multiculturalist society? Are you doing something that's good for you or bad for you? Good for the group or bad for the group? Or do you have a multicultural point of view, which means that it kind of depends on the situation. So ultimately, there's certainly people that fight back against authority or push back against authority, but usually there's going to be some other reason or some other value or belief in them to make them be willing to disobey. One more super famous experiment that investigated obedience was Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. I know many of you have heard of this one. The experiment was when college students acted as prisoners and guards. They were split into either prisoners or guards for 2 weeks and then went into a prison-like setting. I will get into this so much more in class, but what was discovered is that the guards, the ones that were given the role of guards, acted in very cruel ways. They would have never acted towards the other prisoners, which were also college students, that basically they took on this role too seriously. And by wearing prison guard uniforms, by wearing sunglasses, by being in a prison like setting, that they kind of took on this role because they were in that situation and it impacted how they behaved. These, as well as Ash and Milgram, are super, super famous studies. It's okay that you just write down the titles for now. We are going to devote a good chunk of a class period really understanding each of these. Got video clips, we'll talk about them, I'll answer whatever questions I can, things like that. So if you're interested, good. I will ask us to come back when we go through these to say what other concepts from other lectures and units seem to be demonstrated in these experiments, what ethical concerns were there, things like that. Okay, so the first half of the lecture was looking at social influences and what influences us to conform, to obey, to want to fit in, and to based on social norms, things like that. But now we need to picture ourselves actually in the group. Here we are, we're in the group. So now we're going to look at how I think there's some typos here. Our behaviors and mental processes are affected by actually being in the presence of others. It's going to be a little bit of a laundry list of definitions, but we really want to focus on, yes, the definitions, but also examples. And I betcha you're going to be able to come up with some of your own as well. Okay, the first one is group polarization. This is when having a discussion about something with a group strengthens that group's prevailing attitudes and opinions. So let's say last year I saw this happen. Last year, seniors got very worked up about senior skip day. And it started off with a bunch of people being like, I'm flexible, I don't care, whatever. Or I have some ideas. But then in discussion, people got more and more passionate. They're like, this is the day it needs to be, and this is the activity we need to do. And if people don't like it, they're wrong. People got super into it. So group polarization can be beneficial or harmful. You usually leave more fired up one way or the other than when you first arrived. So something you might not have cared about, all of a sudden you're super passionate about and maybe motivated to go after. That can be a good thing. But maybe now you're more passionate, angry than you were before. So the group made you feel polarized or pushed to one extreme or the other of a certain opinion. So group discussion made something more intense. Groupthink. This is when there's such a desire for harmony and decision making that it overrides sharing the possible alternatives. You don't want to make waves. Maybe you have a great idea for senior skip day, but there's 5 or 6 other people that are already talking about going to a brewer game. And so even though you've got a good idea, you don't want to mention it. You're not even going to bring it up because just I want to go with the flow. I don't want to make things hard for everybody else. So you go along with the rest of the group's decision or the decision of the loudest person in the group to just make it easier. But the problem with that is you might silence a really good idea. Or if we put this in terms of like politics or some sort of important decision, you don't want to be like, I don't want to share my opinion just to upset people if the consequences are something way more serious than a senior skip day. Okay, social loafing. I know you guys know this one. This is when people in a group exert less effort than when working individually. They might feel less accountable or like, oh, I'm sorry, not they. You might feel less accountable or like your part isn't that important if you're doing group work. So you might get kind of lazy. You might not feel like your part is super important or useful. And hey, if you just kind of sit this one out, it's okay. So we kind of sometimes do less when we're working in a group because we can rely on other people to help us out. But kind of the opposite of that is social facilitation. This is when we have improved performance on a task in the presence of others. Because you know others are relying on you or watching you, you're actually going to do more. You're going to do better. So sometimes you hear like athletes or performers do better when it's go time, when they actually have to play a game and not practice, or actually need to go on stage and not practice. That there's something about the energy of that moment that makes you really rise up and do the best you can. This usually occurs with either simple or well learned tasks, but not really with difficult or not yet mastered tasks. In fact, with those, if things are too hard or something that we're really unsure of, we actually can do worse in front of others. Next is de-individuation. This is when you are in a huge crowd and so you start doing things you wouldn't normally do. So it's a loss of identity, self-awareness, and restraint in emotional group situations where you feel anonymous. So you can see these two pictures. I can't honestly tell you, even looking close, where these were, but I can tell you the general concept. These are groups of college kids storming the streets and rioting and being foolish because their sports team won the thing. Obviously, this is football, but the sports team won the thing, so it becomes like a mob mentality. And you feel like, hey, no one can point me out individually. So many people are breaking the law. So many people are doing naughty things. So I'm not really accountable for my actions. And because no one knows me, I can go wild. I can lose my inhibitions and I can be a little bit crazy and break rules because I'm not going to get caught. Well, let me tell you, people get caught more often than not. I mean, come on. You can totally tell who people are in these pictures. Now, this next one's a little different. And this is when someone acts in their own best interest against the group. Okay, so this is when people do not unite and come together in the spirit of group harmony, but rather they act in their own self interest to the detriment of the group. This is something also known as prisoner's dilemma. I will give you a little bit more of a detailed explanation of that one in class. But I'll give you two examples right now of a social trap. One is at kind of a large scale. This is, for example, when a company needs to dump its toxic waste. For the sake of the company, man, we just got to get rid of this stuff. We're going to just dump it in the river. We're going to dump it in the ocean. We're going to dump it in the woods, something like that, because we need to just get it out of the plant. So this is what we need, and what we need is more important than the bigger picture of, like, say, the environment. Perhaps on the individual scale, an example I have is that um, car owners might think to themselves, electric cars are more expensive. Um, and I know that electric cars are supposed to be better for the environment, but hey, if I drive my car that uses regular gas, it's one car. How bad can the gas that I burn up and the pollution I put into the air really hurt the ozone layer? Well, sure. But of course, if we all felt that way, which a lot of times we do, and we all run our cars on gas and we don't make any improvements to like the fuel efficiency and the pollution output of our cars, it's hurting the environment. So even though, yes, you as one person um, might not cause a lot of damage, you have to consider that we're all in this together, so to speak. And now the opposite. Superordinate goals or superordinate goals. I feel like I'm supposed to blend that better. Superordinate goals are those shared goals that could only be achieved through cooperation. So, um, like when you unite opposing groups, groups that don't normally get along under a common goal. This action, especially when it's natural and it's organic and happens on its own, can actually help opposing groups with stereotypes about each other or negative feelings about each other come together. So one famous study that demonstrated this was something called the Robbers Cave study. And I don't have the year, but I want to say like the 1970s. Some young boys were sent to camp and they were set up into two opposing groups. First, they were put against each other in conflict and told over and over again that they were opposing enemies in every game and task they needed to do, and very, very competitive. But then after a while, it shifted and they were given tasks that they could only achieve when they worked together. And what was found is that once they had to work together to achieve the goals, they made friends and they stopped thinking the worst of each other. And so the conclusion is that isolation and competition makes enemies, but shared problems and goals makes friends. Okay, I realize this lecture is getting a little long, but I'm so close, so I'm going to keep going, and I'll probably assign this in two chunks anyways. But our last topic is pro-social behavior, because a lot of the examples I gave you are why people act inappropriately. And now I want to say, what I want to talk about, why do people do things for others? Well, this is the study of altruism. Altruism is unselfish regard for the welfare of others, or in other words, selfless behavior. Why do people do good things? So, three reasons. First of all, to balance social, well, overall, to balance the concept of like a social debt, that someone owes you something. So we have the social reciprocity norm that we should return help to those who have helped us. We also have the social responsibility norm that it's the right thing to do to help others, that it's a learned expectation to help others in need, that you were raised in a society where we're taught to help one another and be a good person. It's part of your responsibility to society. But then it kind of boils down to something known as the social exchange theory, that the decision to help is based on how much it will cost me compared to the benefit of me. How much time will I have to give up to help this person? What do I get out of it? So either we're helping because someone helps me, we're helping because it's the right thing to do, or I'm helping because the costs aren't too bad and the benefits outweigh the costs. And it's better for me to help than to not help. What are the influences on pro-social behavior? What makes us more willing to help? Well, a couple things. The clarity for the need of help. The more obvious the need for help, more likely help will be given most of the time. We definitely still dodge it sometimes. But if you see someone drop a book, you might think to themselves, they can pick it up. But if you see someone drop a book, empty their bag, and stuff goes everywhere, and that they seem really in a hurry, you might be more willing to help because it's a bigger deal. Or like if you see a fender bender, you might not help. But if you see a huge crash, you might be more willing to because it's so obvious that your help is needed. The presence of others. Are other people there who could maybe help? This can be a really tricky problem because if there's a lot of other people around who could help, you're giving yourself an excuse maybe not to help. We call that the bystander effect. The tendency where, as the number of people present increases, the likelihood that even one person will help decreases. So the more people that are around, you kind of think like they can help, they can help, they can help. Why not me? But if you're there by yourself, you might think it's only up to me to help. This is a result of something called a diffusion of responsibility. If more people are present, the responsibility for helping spreads amongst all present, and you don't feel that burden on your personal shoulders. In class, I'll tell you a pretty detailed event that happened a while ago of a terrible attack on a woman where something like 27 people had an opportunity to help and didn't. But we'll save that for class. Finally, last slide, the mood of the helper could influence whether or not they help. We have, this is one of my favorite terms, I love this term, the feel good, do good phenomenon. This is the tendency of people to be more altruistic, more helpful to others when they are in a good mood. especially if someone recently helped them. So if you're in a good mood or you felt like someone else just had your back, you're going to be more willing to have somebody else's back. So like maybe your coach needs your help to pick up after practice, and they also just really put a lot of time and effort into you during that practice. You're going to be more willing to be like, I got you, coach. I'll stay late. I'll help you out because you know that they recently helped you out. And now you're in a good mood because you had a good practice. And then here are some interesting ones. There are lots and lots of environmental factors too. This isn't just a short list. There's more that I could add. But here are some interesting things that make someone more willing to help. Living in a small town where more people know each other and feel more invested in their community. There's probably a diffusion of responsibility opposite effect with that. Not being in a rush or hurry. Sure, I can help. Why not? Observing someone else being helpful. Well, if they're helping, I guess I should too. It'll make me look good, or it seems like that's not too much of a burden. I can help too. So, some social norm pressure to be helpful and to not be preoccupied with other tasks. Oh, I would love to help you, but I have this going on, this going on, this going on. If that list is shorter, of course, you're more willing to help. All right, this was long, but we got social psych done. Good for us. And thanks for putting in the time.